The joke that would echo through rock history forever began with Jimi Hendrix's laughter cutting through a haze of cigarette smoke in a cramped London backstage room. It was 1968, the year when music felt like revolution itself, and two guitar gods stood face to face in a moment that seemed almost too casual for its weight. Hendrix, loose and electric even off stage, flashed that mischievous grin that had melted 1,000 audiences and threw out the challenge as if he were suggesting they grab fish and chips. His words hung in the air like a dare from the universe itself. Swap guitars, play each other's signature songs, right here, right now, in front of whoever showed up. The dingy room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in as cigarette smoke curled toward flickering light bulbs that barely pushed back the darkness. Jimmy Page stood frozen, his mind racing through every possibility, every note, every consequence of saying yes to something this impossible. Around them, roadies stopped coiling cables, and sound engineers looked up from their equipment, sensing they were witnessing the prelude to something legendary. Hendrix held out his Stratocaster with one hand, that smile never fading, completely unaware he had just lit a fuse that would burn straight into rock and roll mythology and change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. Page felt the weight of impossible expectation settle onto his shoulders like a leaden cloak, his throat tightening as he stared at the outstretched Stratocaster that might as well have been Excalibur itself. Everyone knew Hendrix was untouchable, a force of nature who bent guitar strings like he was reshaping reality, and here stood Page, brilliant in his own right but facing a challenge that felt designed to expose every limitation. His fingers twitched involuntarily, muscle memory already betraying his nervousness, while his mind catalogued every Hendrix performance he had obsessively studied in darkened venues across London, notebook hidden in his jacket pocket, sketching. Techniques like a devoted monk, copying sacred texts. What Hendrix did not know, could not know, was that Page had spent countless midnight hours alone with his Gibson, dissecting those impossible runs and feedback swells, not to steal them, but to understand the architecture of genius itself. The room had gone silent now, waiting, and Page could feel dozens of eyes burning into him from the shadows where session musicians and hangers-on had materialized like witnesses to an execution. Hendrix's grin had not faded, but something flickered in those dark eyes, a challenge wrapped in genuine curiosity, as if he was saying without words that respect meant being willing to risk humiliation in pursuit of something true. Page's hand moved toward the Stratocaster, trembling just barely, knowing this single moment would define how history remembered him, not as someone who played it safe behind mystical blues progressions and studio perfection, but as a man brave enough to stand naked before greatness. The wood felt alien against his palm, foreign and electric, with possibility. The whisper began in the alley behind the Speakeasy Club, where a roadie with wide eyes grabbed a bassist's sleeve and breathed the impossible news into smoke-thick air. Within minutes, the underground network of London's music elite crackled to life through payphone calls and frantic knocks on dressing room doors, each message carrying the same electric urgency that made hands shake as they dialed the next number. By midnight, black cabs were converging on an unmarked door in Soho, depositing legends who moved through shadows like conspirators planning revolution rather than witnesses to a guitar duel. The illegal after-hours club called The Cavern's Basement had never held such concentrated genius, its brick walls sweating with history in the making as Eric Clapton arrived first, followed by Jeff Beck, who nodded silent acknowledgement to his rival. George Harrison slipped in through the kitchen entrance, bringing Paul McCartney, who looked around with the wonder of a man watching, his own influences being rewritten in real time. Session players who had shaped countless hits pressed against walls, their professional composure cracking as they realized they were watching something that would be whispered about for generations. The air hung thick with cigarette smoke and anticipation, creating a cathedral atmosphere where even breathing felt like intrusion. Page stood at the center of this gathering storm, transformed from nervous challenger into something else entirely. A man representing every guitarist who had ever dared to reach beyond their limitations toward the unreachable. Hendrix moved through the crowd like a man walking toward his own reflection, his fingers already dancing in anticipation as he lifted Page's Gibson with ceremonial reverence. The weight felt different in his hands, heavier somehow, carrying the ghost of every blues lick Page had coaxed from its wooden throat, and for one breath the room held its collective lungs waiting for the first note. When it came, the sound tore through the basement like lightning splitting ancient oak, transforming the familiar opening into something that existed beyond imitation, beyond homage, into pure reimagining that made even Page's jaw slacken. Hendrix didn't play the song as much as he possessed it, bending the mystical blues phrases into cosmic statements that spoke of galaxies Page had only dreamed about, each note a conversation between what was and what could be. Clapton's cigarette burned forgotten between his fingers as Hendrix's interpretation shifted the song's DNA while keeping its soul intact, proving that greatness recognizes greatness not through competition, but through elevation. The Gibson sang in frequencies it had never voiced before, Page's carefully constructed mystery exploding into Hendrix's raw spontaneity, creating something that belonged to neither man but to the space between their visions. When the final note died, the silence carried more weight than applause ever could, a collective exhale of witnesses who understood they had just watched. Impossible become inevitable. Page stood frozen, his eyes reflecting not defeat but recognition, seeing his own artistry reflected back through a mirror that showed him possibilities he had never considered. The Stratocaster felt like holding lightning bottled in wood and wire, its curves unfamiliar against Page's chest as he stood beneath the single amber bulb that turned the basement into a confessional. His fingers found the frets with archaeological caution, each placement a prayer to gods of music he wasn't sure would answer him, while the room pressed closer, with breath held and judgment suspended in cigarette smoke. Page could feel Hendrix's residual energy humming through the strings like electricity through copper, and he understood, with sudden clarity, that copying would be surrender, that survival meant revelation rather than replication. When his fingers began moving, they spoke a different language entirely, transforming the expected electric fury into whispered confession, each note stripped to its skeletal truth. The crowd leaned forward as one organism, confusion rippling through the legends assembled, because Page was doing the unthinkable by making the untouchable song vulnerable, exposing the loneliness beneath its swagger. His technique became transparency, the precision that defined him now serving emotional archaeology, digging beneath Hendrix's cosmic showmanship to find the wounded poet who wrote the words first. Beck exchanged glances with Clapton, both recognizing the audacity of Page's gambit, this refusal to compete on Hendrix's terms, but instead to offer interpretation as intimacy. The Gibson's usual mysticism gave way to raw honesty, Page's fingers trembling slightly on the higher register, that vulnerability becoming strength rather than weakness. His eyes remained closed, shutting out the judgment, diving deeper into the song's marrow where competition dissolved into communion. The room no longer wondered if Page could match Hendrix technically, because he had changed the question entirely, proving that courage meant showing your own soul rather than mimicking someone else's fire. Page's fingers found melodies between the thunder, translating electric prophecy into acoustic prayer, each string bend carrying the weight of understanding rather than imitation. The Stratocaster sang in whispers where it once screamed, its voice transformed from warrior's cry to lover's confession, revealing that beneath every revolution lives a human heart seeking connection. His right hand barely kissed the strings, coaxing rather than commanding, proving that power sometimes speaks loudest in silence, that the bravest guitarists strip away armor instead of adding more. The crowd witnessed alchemy as Page transmuted Hendrix's cosmic fire into earthbound truth, showing that genuine respect means hearing what the artist dreamed before the world made them immortal. Clapton leaned against the brick wall, arms crossed, recognizing in Page's interpretation a different species of genius. The courage to be vulnerable when everyone expected virtuosity, to choose emotional truth over technical warfare. Beck's cigarette burned forgotten between his fingers as he watched Page's face contort with the effort of restraint, every muscle fighting the impulse to flash and dazzle, instead channeling decades of discipline into 4 minutes of naked honesty. The Beatles members exchanged knowing glances, understanding that they were witnessing a masterclass in artistic bravery, the kind that risks ridicule to achieve transcendence. Even the hardened session musicians felt their cynicism crack, because Page had done something more dangerous than failing. He had succeeded by refusing to compete. The acoustic reimagining peeled back layers of distortion to expose the song's gujia, its fundamental architecture of longing and confusion that connected to something universal rather than supernatural. Page's vibrato wavered deliberately, humanizing the notes, admitting that perfection was never the point, that music's highest calling was communion rather than conquest. The final chord dissolved into smoke-thick air, and for 3 heartbeats the room existed in cathedral silence. Then Hendrix rose like a man possessed, chair scraping against concrete, his movements urgent and unsteady as tears carved rivers down his high cheekbones. He crossed the distance between them, while Page still cradled the Stratocaster, both men locked in a moment that transcended competition, and when Hendrix pulled him into an embrace, the entire club felt the ground shift beneath London's ancient streets. Hendrix's lips moved against Page's ear, words meant for one soul alone. And those who stood closest saw Page's expression transform from vulnerable exhaustion to something resembling spiritual awakening. The whisper lasted maybe 5 seconds, but Page would carry its weight for the rest of his breathing days, his eyes closing as understanding flooded through him like electricity finding earth. Hendrix stepped back, gripping Page's shoulders, studying his face with an intensity that made the watching legends feel like intruders in a sacred exchange. Clapton would later swear he saw something pass between them that night. Not rivalry, but recognition. 2 artists acknowledging they'd glimpsed the same truth through different colored glass. Beck stubbed out his forgotten cigarette, realizing that what Page had offered wasn't interpretation, but translation, converting Hendrix's cosmic language into something his own heart had always struggled to articulate. The crowd remained frozen, sensing they'd witnessed not a battle, but a communion, 2 guitar gods discovering brotherhood in the space between notes. Page handed back the Stratocaster with trembling reverence, and Hendrix smiled through tears, nodding slowly as if sealing an unspoken covenant that would outlive them both. Hendrix moved to the bar, where someone's abandoned drink left a wet ring on scarred wood, and without ceremony he grabbed a crumpled napkin, smoothing it flat with hands that had just reshaped musical history. Page watched as Hendrix pulled a stub of pencil from his jacket, the kind stagehands used for set lists, and began writing with surprising care, his lips moving silently as he etched coordinates into paper that would become prophecy. The date emerged first, then an address in Morocco where Hendrix dreamed of recording, a place where desert winds carried frequencies the Western world had forgotten, and he slid the napkin across to Page, like a contract written in hope rather than ink. Page lifted it with the solemnity of a man receiving scripture, reading the words twice before folding it with geometric precision and tucking it deep into his guitar case's hidden pocket, the one he reserved for things that mattered beyond measure. The promise hung between them now, tangible, as the smoke curling toward water-stained ceilings, and Page extended his hand not for a shake but palm up, an offering of partnership that Hendrix met with his own, their fingers interlacing briefly in a grip that felt like sealing fate itself. Around them the legends began to murmur, sensing something monumental had crystallized, though none could name exactly what they'd witnessed beyond two titans choosing creation over competition. The tour bus rattled through September rain when Page found it again, that napkin now yellowed like ancient parchment, tucked beneath spare strings where memory had buried it alongside grief too heavy to carry. His hands shook as he unfolded the fragile square, seeing Hendrix's handwriting still bold despite time's cruelty, that Moroccan address now a destination for ghosts, and something broke open inside him that no amount of whiskey or distraction had managed to touch. He sat alone in the back lounge while bandmates slept, pressing his palms against his eyes until colors bloomed in the eye. Darkness, hearing phantom notes of what they might have created together echo through the chambers of his chest. The next 3 months became a fever dream of creation. Page arriving at studios before dawn with hollowed eyes and fingers that wouldn't stop moving, channeling the unfinished conversation into every note he coaxed from wood and wire. He pushed the band toward territories they'd never explored, weaving Eastern modalities with blues foundations, building sonic cathedrals from the blueprint Hendrix had sketched in that smoky room where everything changed. His guitar began speaking in two voices now, his own precision married to the wild vulnerability he'd glimpsed in his friends. Playing, and the music that emerged carried the weight of promises kept through the only language that transcended death. The Royal Albert Hall fell into cathedral silence when Page walked on stage that winter evening, silver threading his hair like wisdom earned through decades of survival and creation. He held the Stratocaster under amber lights, the same one Hendrix had surrendered that legendary night, now restored and waiting like a time capsule of brotherhood. His voice cracked slightly as he told the story completely for the first time, every detail spilling out like confession, and when he reached the whisper, grown men in the audience touched their faces, finding wetness there. The recording began to play through vintage speakers, crackling with analog warmth, and suddenly everyone heard what only legends had witnessed. Two guitars speaking languages beyond technique or fame. The music that emerged from those speakers carried the DNA of everything Page had become, proof that grief could transform into beauty when channeled. Through stubborn devotion and respect, you could hear the exact moment when Hendrix's cosmic wildness merged with Page's architectural precision, blueprint for every collaboration that followed across his storied career. The younger guitarists in attendance leaned forward, like pilgrims receiving communion, understanding finally that technical mastery meant nothing without the courage to be vulnerable. Page stood motionless as his younger self played through time's membrane, tears streaming freely now, no longer ashamed of the love that had shaped his entire artistic journey. When the final note decayed into silence, Page lifted the Stratocaster skyward as if offering it back to the heavens that claimed his brother too soon. He spoke directly into the microphone with steady conviction, explaining how that napkin had haunted and guided him through every album, every experimental passage, every risk that defined his legacy. The promise hadn't died with Hendrix, but had multiplied through influence, inspiring generations to play, with both precision and abandon, to honor tradition while exploding boundaries. His voice strengthened as he declared that their collaboration never ended, but continued breathing through everyone who dared to blend discipline with wild-hearted courage. The standing ovation lasted 17 minutes, while Page simply stood there absorbing the recognition that he'd kept faith with something larger than ego or commercial success. He'd transformed personal tragedy into communal inspiration, proving that true artistry meant carrying forward the visions of those who departed before their time. The footage went viral immediately, guitarists worldwide posting tearful reactions. Understanding Finally, that Page's entire career had been an answer to that whispered acknowledgement. In protecting and revealing this story when the world needed it most, he'd completed the circle, showing that legends don't die when we refuse to let their truths fade into silence. What promise are you keeping alive through your own creative journey? Subscribe to witness more stories where music transcends time and brotherhood defies death.